I don't really use white pen for much. How did I end up with so many white pens? I don't know. Jem here, welcome to the Colour Cave. I have amassed a fortune of white pens and I thought I would take the opportunity to actually do something with them and create some sort of useful content at the same time. So for your viewing pleasure today, I am going to put all the white pens that I own to the test. White pen is great for embellishing your drawings and your colouring pages if you want to add highlights or just brighten an area up. So we'll do a bit of scribbling with them and see what they are up to. I'm just going to pick them all up off the desk and then we can get going. The pens that I have for testing today are as follows. Jelly Roll 08, Jelly Roll 10, the Jelly Roll Souffle, Uni-Ball Signo 0.7 tip, Uni-Ball Signo Broad, Pentel Hybrid Gel Grip DX, Pentel Milky Pop, Uni Posca 1M, and the Sharpie Oil Base. Right, so there's a few tests that I want to do with these just to show you how they go down and so on and so forth. I would just like to add a disclaimer at this moment. I have a coloured post-it notepad here and I use these all the time when I am working with gel pens and white pens, and I just use them to get the ink flowing before I start on the actual piece that I'm doing. So I will be doing that today when we're testing these out. I will let you know how often I'm having to do it though, so that you know for yourself when you go to pick a gel pen if you're looking for a new one. The idea is that we are going to test them out on neutral tone paper and also on black paper to let you see the ink flow and how they stand out against the paper and that kind of thing. And I also have a third test which I prepared the other day simply because it took quite a long time to do, but it shows you each pen on coloured pencil, but I'll get into that a bit more in just a while. As we go along, I'm going to explain a wee bit about each of the pens just so that you get to know some facts and figures about them. So I'm going to start with the Jelly Rolls because I have 3 of them. Now the main differences between these 3 are the 0.8 and the 10 are supposed to be different line widths. I don't have an exact measurement for them, but you will see them in action just shortly. The Jelly Roll Souffle is a slightly different beast. One of the main differences between it and the other 2 Jelly Roll pens is that it is a lot more transparent and it looks quite watery when it goes down, but it's supposed to do that. It's quite difficult to see what you're doing sometimes because it goes on almost clear and you've got to wait for it to dry and it whitens up as it dries. The other thing about Souffle is it's meant to leave a slightly raised surface, almost like an embossed surface, and that's kind of the angle that we're going with. So I'm not going to be able to show you that because the only way you can show that is by, you know, like running your finger over it and feeling it, but you'll see it when the ink goes down. So what I want to do is just a quick test, and we're going to start on this toned paper, which is lovely. I like it very much to draw on. And we'll start with the Jelly Roll 10. Now I have been using this one most out of all of my gel pens. Not that I use them very often, but here's my little post-it note and I'm just going to get it started and you can see that it's writing straight away. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just show you the ink flow, and I'm going to zoom in a bit for this. So you can see how well this pen flows, and I'm only using one stroke. I'm not going back over anything. And it goes in all directions and the ink flow is quite smooth. And I'm having no issues with it skipping or anything like that. Now, the one test for me is whether or not it withstands the scrubby motion, and when I say scrubby motion, I mean this. How much could you actually colour in? So I'm going over it one way and then going back over it. So that is 2 coats, while the first coat is still wet. So that looks pretty good. It's nice and even, and it's quite a thick line though, so you might struggle a little bit with the number 10 if you're working in really, really tight spaces. On to the Jelly Roll 8. Now I don't know if you can see much of a difference, but you can see that the line width is a bit thinner in this one, and I think it makes it look a little bit more washed out as well. And I would say this doesn't stand out as well on the toned paper as the 10. However, the same thing, obviously it's the same manufacturing build, so I'm not getting any skipping or any problems with the tip clogging up or anything like that, and its scrubbing value is very, very similar to the 10. So I would say that's a more delicate tip compared to the Jelly Roll 10. Onto the Souffle now. As I said, this is a bit of a different beast, and you will see what I mean in just a moment. So I'm just testing this to make sure that the ink's flowing. And when you put it down, you can barely see what you've put down. I can see that it's wet on the paper, even though you can't see much. But the ink flow is much more watery on the Souffle, for the aforementioned reason that it has to have a fast flow to come out, and it's so that there's plenty of the ink sitting on the surface of the paper to give it that raised feeling. And you can see that the first part that I've written is actually starting to dry now, and you can see that it's coming through and it's whitening up a little bit. And the scrub value is interesting because you don't actually know how well it's done until it's dried a bit. So we can come back to that one in a minute, but you can see it's starting to show up. But it is a lot more transparent than the other two, so you're kind of going for a slightly different effect with the Souffle. Alright, let's move on to the Uni-Ball pens. Now these are quite popular and a lot of people really, really like them, and that's kind of like a go-to gel pen for them. Me, however, not so much. I have never got on well with rollerball pens in general, and I have learned more recently that it's quite a common factor in amongst left-handed people. I don't quite know the significance or the technical points of this, but even when I'm writing with a normal pen, I tend to avoid rollerball pens because I don't get on very well with them. So it'll be interesting to see how I get on, knowing that this is a sort of tried and tested brand and it is a firm favourite. The broad tip and what I would say is the normal tip, which is 0.7. So I'm going to start with the broad tip, and just to make sure that there's nothing clogging it or anything, I'm going to start it off on my little post-it note. So there's the ink is flowing. So let's see how we get on. Straight away issues. I have been told with these Uni-Ball pens that the ink flow isn't quite as fast, and you have to work slower when you're actually using them. You know, you have to move your hand a lot more slowly than you would do with the Jelly Rolls. But there we go. Now that I'm going, helps if you can spell, Gem. It's kind of difficult to talk and spell things at the same time. It feels a lot more scratchy under my hand than the Jelly Rolls do. But yeah, okay, it still feels alright. I think at this point I still favour the Jelly Rolls over this one. And there we go, we're starting to skip now. And because I'm moving my hand faster, there's, you know, the ink's struggling to keep up. So let's go back over that. There we go. Now you can see, if I just jump back to show you the Souffle now, that has dried up, and you can see, if I just hold this up for you, that it is slightly more opaque. It's slightly more opaque. You can see that it is slightly more transparent, but if I run my finger over this, it's bumpy. And that's the idea behind the Souffle. You can build the Souffle up in layers the same way as you can with other gel pens, and the more you put on, the more raised it's going to be off the page, which is kind of cool. I quite like that. So the first comparison, and the thing that sticks out for me straight away, is how white the Uni-Ball signal is compared to the other ones. It does stand out much more on this tan paper. So that's something to note, but I will say it's not as comfortable to use, and it is a little bit scratchy. And you can see from this part here, and if you move over here, and the scrubbing is, it's not as smooth. It's still pretty good though, to be fair. We're going to try with the middle nib, as I call it, the 0.7, and see how we get on with this one. And there's nothing happening. Over to my post-it note, there we go. This feels a lot more dainty. I think it's maybe because the actual barrel of the pen isn't so thick. It just feels much finer, and I think this would be much more useful for smaller spaces compared to the other ones that we've used, because much as the jelly rolls are nice and, you know, the laydown is really good, they do feel quite clumsy and the tip of the nib is quite thick, so it might not be so good if you're working in a more confined area. The ink flow seems to be a bit better in this one compared to the broad one as well. It feels a bit smoother, but it does still feel quite scratchy, but you're always going to get that with these pens anyway, to a degree. I mean, the smoothest I think you're going to get might be the jelly rolls, the way things are going. Alright, let's move on to the Pentel pens now. As I said before, we have the Milky Pop and the original Hybrid Gel DX, the Hybrid Gel DX pen. And that one is a 1mm nib that's on it. So we'll start with the Milky Pop. And I like this pen, it feels quite fun. I think it might be aimed at a slightly younger market, just with the you know, the branding and the sort of the pretty bits on it and stuff. But anyway, it's got a nice grip on it though here. Now this ink flow feels much more like the jelly rolls. It's much freer flowing. I do notice it is slightly more watery looking. It might even be closer to the Souffle in terms of its opacity. But again, this feels a little bit nicer to use. Oh, we're not doing so well there. It's kind of struggling there when I start to speed up. The ink flow's kind of running away from me. There we go. I have to say, all of these are performing surprisingly well. On to the Hybrid Gel. This is the original Pentel pen. Again, it has a nice grip on it. Down at the bottom makes it feel a little bit more luxurious. Yeah, this feels better already. This feels like a more expensive gel pen. The ink flows much faster and it's giving me a much chunkier line straight away. And I can go quite quickly with it. And it's not skipping on me or anything. And there we go, when we go into that sort of scrubbing motion, it's keeping up no problem. Absolutely no problem. And I can get a really nice thick layer. It's covering over itself really, really well. If you compare that to the likes of the jelly roll, it's a much, much thicker consistency over the two, you know, going back and forth one way and then the other. Okay, now the last two, I know these aren't strictly gel pens, but they are white pens that are, you know, that are used for artwork. So I thought I would just include them because I had them. So I have the Posca pen here, and you've got to shake this. So I'm just going to get this primed and going. And this is a paint pen, so you're not going to get the same results as you get with the gel pens. It is a different nib as well, so you have to be aware of that too, but it has a very, very fine point on it, and you can get these in all different sizes. I like this size because it's small enough for details, but if you want to cover a larger area, it's really good as well. And you have absolutely no issues with skipping or anything like that just because it is paint. Now the downside to that is you can see it's quite watery compared to the gel pens. However, the added advantage is you can do exactly the same. You can build up layers the same way as you can with the gel pen. And the difference is sometimes if you try to go over your gel pen and it's not dry, you end up scraping it off rather than building it up. The Posca pens dry really, really quickly and you can go back over them, you know, pretty much straight away, which is really, really good. And when you're doing things like this, you're going to get a much, much smoother line. And the same for when you're scrubbing like this as well. And if I use the side of that nib, the amount of colour that I can put down in one go is much, much more substantial. So if you're working in a much larger area, I would suggest that the Posca pen is a good idea. I'm going to let that dry and I'm going to go back over all of them just in some of the sections to let you see what a second coat would look like on top of what's already there. Lastly, now this is a bit of a beastie and I use this for really large drawings. This is the Sharpie marker and it is an oil based one. So again, it's a completely different composition from anything that we've got so far. My only complaint about this is the nib is absolutely massive, so it's not really suitable for fine lines and fine work, but apparently this is the medium point one. I am assuming that you do get them in different tip sizes. So this is going to take a bit more room. So in nature, I would say it's probably closer to the Posca pen than anything else. However, it does seem to be really, really, really transparent and it's not coping very well on this toned paper at all. I think you would probably have to do several layers of this for it to even look halfway like it's worth putting down. It's almost disappearing here now. It feels really chunky, really clumsy. Oh. It's nice for doing that with though. So you get nice smooth lines with it. Let's see what it's like filling in. And the paper is just soaking that up, as we would say. It is just soaking in so quickly to the paper. It's just as if the paper's thirsty and it just wants to take it all, absorb it all. When you see them from a distance like this, the ones that stand out for me most are the Uni-Ball Signal Broad in terms of how much it stands out on the paper. But for smoothness, I would say it's pretty close between the Pentel Hybrid and the Jelly Rolls, more likely the 10. I just realised I've made a mistake. That shouldn't say 10. This will give me a good chance to go back over things. See? There's no mistakes, there's only happy accidents. So let me find the 8 again. Ah, there it is. Okay, so we're going to score this out. And that is the 0.8. So what I want to do is in the areas where I've scrubbed, I just want to put another coat on and leave it to dry so that you can see what it's like when it's built up in layers. I'm assuming that most of them are quite dry by now. The Posca is still a little bit damp and the Sharpie is absolutely bone dry. So this is coat number 3 technically speaking, and the Jelly Roll 10 is performing wonderfully and that's given us a nice thick coat. So if you're wanting to cover things up, that's a really, really good option. As for the 8, let's just see how we go. It doesn't seem to be doing quite as much, if I'm honest. But okay. But it's coming up so white. I mean, any of these pens stand out really, really well. The Souffle might be interesting though. We're going to have to wait a while for that one. This was one of the ones that I really wanted to show you the extra layer on because it does build upon itself very well. So if you want that slightly more transparent look, you can use 1 or 2 coats. But if you want it much, much more opaque, then you can build up the layers. You will go through quite a lot of that quite quickly though, that is the only thing. Now this does not like this at all. I'm actually scratching through. Just look at that. I am scratching through what is already there. That does not like that at all. Oh, that's messy. In terms of building up layers, the Uni-Ball Signal is a big fat. Let's try with the smaller one and see how we get on with that. Better than the broad one, not great. Yeah, okay, not great. Try the Milky Pop now and see how we go with that. I'm just checking that it is dry. It's definitely dry. Yeah, the Milky Pop's not doing much either. It's not really adding anything to it. It's just kind of like pushing around what's already there. Yeah, it looks quite scrubby. Let's try with the hybrid. Now, this is a different story. This is going down beautifully on top of what's already there. That just shows you the difference in the generosity of the ink flow. This is actually coming out like Tipp-Ex, you know, like correction fluid. It's really, really thick, and it's covering up, and it's not pulling away anything that's already on the paper at all. So that is a huge thumbs up for the Pentel Hybrid. And now back to the markers. Now this is the interesting one with the Posca pen. This is paint. You've got to remember it's paint. And although it will soak into the paper, it doesn't do it quite as dramatically as the Sharpie marker. But because it is being absorbed into the paper, you'll be able to do, you know, to put a good couple of layers on top of it before you start to destroy the paper. So that's pretty good. You can see the difference in that straight away compared to what's next to it. Now, we'll leave it to dry and see what it looks like in a little second. And onto the Sharpie. Sharpie. I think this is actually starting to tear up the paper a little bit already. I can feel it sort of coming away under the nib of the pen. And then that's a really generous coat I've put on that again, and I have this horrible feeling that it's just going to disappear and suck into the paper. The danger with these types of pens as well is if you are wanting to put multiple layers on, what will happen is that the paper will suck up so much of the pen that it'll actually start to buckle the paper, you know, it'll end up being warped. So you've got to be careful on, depending on what type of paper that you're using with things like that. There we go. So in terms of a nice solid colour, the Pentel Hybrid wins hands down. It's absolutely solid, and it is the whitest of white. And I don't know how well that's coming up on the camera, but from where I'm sitting, it's night and day compared to the other ones. It is so bright, it is so white. So in terms of that, on the tan paper, the Pentel Hybrid, which is the thicker pen, not the Milky Pop, this is pretty good. I'm quite impressed. So in terms of doing this little exercise, I'd have to say that my two favourites are probably the Jelly Roll 10, because it is so smooth and it's lovely to write with it or draw lines with it, or whatever you want to say. And the Pentel Hybrid comes a really close second, and it's probably on par with the Jelly Roll 10 in terms of the performance, but it's just a slightly finer nib on it, so I would get on better in tighter spaces with this, and I tend to use it for detail work, so that makes more sense. If I take the caps off both of them together, they don't actually look any different in size, but the point on the Pentel Hybrid is just tapered inward slightly more at the end, and that's what gives it that less sort of slightly clumsy feeling than the Jelly Roll, but the Jelly Roll's still by far my favourite. Alright, I want to move on to the black paper now, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing again, and we'll do them in the same order so that we don't get confused. Oh my goodness. So let's start with the Jelly Roll 10, and I've had to do nothing to prime this whatsoever. This is just me going straight onto the paper. Now, one of the things that we use these pens for, especially as colourists, on black paper or dark surfaces, is making stars. So we better test the flicky motion. And I'm sure some of you'll know what I mean by the flicky motion. This. That's come out pretty well. That looks like a star to me. Let's see how we go doing a bit of colouring in with it. Back to scrub-a-dub-dub. And that just looks wonderful on this black paper, it really does. So this is so smooth. I do have quite cursive handwriting, and it does lend itself to that sort of flowy motion. So my handwriting is actually a really good test. Okay, this is flicking well as well. Great stuff. And you can see just from doing those stars, that's really where it shows that that's a finer point on the 08 than the 10. But yeah, my handwriting really lends itself to testing the flow of a pen just because it is very cursive. And again, the same thing, no issues at all in terms of scrubbing away if you want to fill in an area. That's looking pretty good. And they're both quite white. Sometimes when you use these pens on black paper, they look as if they've got a sort of yellowish tint to them, but the Jelly Rolls are holding up their end of the deal, no problem. And here we go with the Souffle. Just have to give it a minute. It is actually a lot easier to see it when it's wet on the black paper than it is on the tan paper, which is pretty good stuff actually. It just makes things a bit easier so that you don't stick your hand in it when you're left-handed, and all fellow lefties, you know what I'm talking about. Do our star. Oh, that didn't feel nice. Did you hear that noise? That wasn't nice. That was like a kind of crunchy sound going on there. Ugh. And I don't think anybody wants a crunchy pen, let's be realistic. Again, it's back to going down really smoothly, and again, because it's watery, it's quite free-flowing. So we'll leave that one to dry, and we'll move on to the Uni-Ball pens. This is where I find this will probably fall down. You know, when I was talking about the rollerball situation, it's not even writing. So I'm on to my post-it note to try and get it going, and there is nothing coming out. It's quite clogged already as well. I'm just wiping off all the kind of cloggy bits, you know, the crispy bits off the end of the nib. Okay, that's us, we're going again. I don't know if you can hear that squeaking. Oh, there's something stuck in there. I've just written Jelly Roll. Ah! I can't even score it out. It's not letting me score it out. Oh, can you hear that? Oh, that's awful. Okay, let's try again. Oh my goodness. I've got something stuck in my roller ball. Oh. Again, it does look really white though compared to the Jelly Rolls and when you're using it to write. Flick test. Oh, squeak. Oh, that's making me put my teeth on edge. It seems to be getting on a bit better on the black paper, but it's still not great. It's still quite scratchy. In terms of how much it stands out though, it's definitely winning so far. Moving on to the 0.7 tip now. Try and write the correct thing this time, Gem. I keep saying it, I'm such a consummate professional. This is I would say this feels more like a writing pen. It feels very natural and it feels very nice to write with. I quite like it. Flick test. Yeah, that's not bad. That's not bad. Swirly test. And finally the scrubby test. Scrubby, scrubby, scrubby. Yeah, this one seems to have a better ink flow than the Broad. It just seems to be easier to work with. The ink flow must be slightly faster in the smaller pen. Moving on to the Pentel, we'll try the Milky Pop. Again, it's got quite a sticky end on it, so I'm just going to clean that off before I start. It seems to be quite sort of crusty. Looking good. It does have that you know, that slight transparency of the Souffle, you know, it's definitely leaning more towards that rather than the traditional gel pens, and I can see it more now on the black paper than, you know, it's more noticeable here than it was on the tan paper earlier on. It's not great for the flickiness. It's not my best star on the page, I don't think. Okay, it's taken the scrubbing in its stride though on the black paper. Again, a little bit more transparent. You know, if you look at it next to the jelly roll, which is nearly dry now, next to the Souffle, the tone of it is much more similar to that than it is of the other more sort of traditional gel pens, shall we say. And on to the hybrid. Not off to a great start here, but the ink flows started to thicken up once I got to this point. Interesting. Again, nice flow. And very generous with the lay down when it comes to filling in and scrubbing away. That looks pretty good, and again it looks quite white. If you put it next to the Uni-Ball Signal, it's maybe not quite as bright as that. It's probably on par with the jelly roll on this dark paper. And onto the markers. So I've got back to the Posca. I always think this pen makes my writing look really lovely. I like it. You do have the danger of splatters with this, that's the only thing, because it is paint. And on black paper that can show up quite significantly. It is quite nice for stars though. I like it for stars. There we go, I'm starting to get splatter underneath because I've put a bit of pressure on the nib. Can you see it? That is the danger of a Posca pen. And let's get some solid colour put down here. I feel wrong using the word colour when I'm using a white pen, but y'all know what I mean anyway, don't you? Yeah, of course you do. And finally, the big bad boy, the Sharpie. I don't even think I can write in my normal handwriting with this, it's that big. I'll try. That does not feel nice at all. Oh, it doesn't look nice either, does it? That's doing next to nothing. Yeah. Yeah. When it first comes out and it first lays down on the paper, you think, oh yeah, great, and then it just sort of disappears. That's poor. Alrighty then. I'll do what I did on the tan paper now, and I'm just going to go back over our filled in areas to see if it'll take any more and build up a bit more. Now I know this is dependent on the paper, but it's still interesting to look at. I'm trying to cover a range of as many activities with a white gel pen as possible, because that's kind of the aim of the game really, isn't it? Interestingly today my ring matches the subject matter. Someone actually asked me about this, why sometimes I wear this, sometimes I don't wear a ring at all, and sometimes I wear my proper engagement ring. I'm quite happy to answer that question. These rings are silicone. They're stretchy and they are used quite often by people who have physical jobs. A lot of tradesmen use them, like plumbers and electricians, and it's so that if you get your finger caught or get your ring caught, it's not going to break your finger or take the skin off your finger, which is known as degloving, and it is disgusting. So when I am working out on the farm, obviously I don't really want to wear my engagement ring out in the farm anyway, because it's going to get dirty and I'm frightened it would get damaged. So this is why a lot of the time, especially if I'm doing a video after I've been out outside working, I've quite often got this one on. I have them in different colours, but I decided to wear the white one up until I get married. That just seemed fitting. So there we go, that answers the questions for you. The days that I don't have my engagement ring on, or any ring on that finger at all, is usually the days I've been cleaning. So I hope that answers everyone's curiosities, and we'll get back to what we're supposed to be talking about. So yeah, I'm going to go back over these scrub bits now, just to see if it's going to take any more of the pen and see what it looked like on the black paper. So back in with the jelly roll, absolutely no problem at all, and it's whitening that up just lovely. I can see on camera that that does look incredibly white as well. That's good. And onto the number 8. And the Souffle. Again, I just have to trust my instincts and know where I'm going here. There is a slight wet sheen to it when you're putting it down, so it's kind of difficult to see if you've already, you know, if you're going back over like that, it's just not quite as obvious. So give that a waft, get it to dry. We'll move on to the Uni Balls again. We have a saying in Scotland, and if something's hot or wet, we say waft it with your bunnet, which means take your hat off your head and flap your hat at it to cool it down or help it dry. So there you go, that's your Scottish lesson for today, waft it with your bunnet. A bunnet comes from the word bonnet, which means hat, obviously. Right, Uni Bowl Signal Broad. Oh, that's just awful. It's awful. Awful, awful. You can see that from there. I don't even need to bring that close to the camera. It's got holes in. Okay, so no layering with the Uni Bowl Signal Broad on either paper. Forget it. That's just a no. That's not going to happen. We'll try with the 0.7, which I did say seemed to have a bit more of a generous ink flow. Yeah, it's not very happy either. No, it's just scrubbing through. It's not laying down anymore. It's actually taken off. It's like I've scraped it with my nail. So again, that's a no-no for layering up. So if you do like multiple layers to get your whites nice and bright, then the signals are a no-go. On to the Milky Pop. Again, I was just checking to make sure that that was definitely dry, and it is. The Milky Pop's not up to much either. No, the same thing's happening with that on the black paper as well. I'm actually taking off rather than putting on. And the Pentel Hybrid. Different story completely. It's behaving very much like the jelly rolls, and it's just making that white even whiter, if there's such a thing as possible. I have to put my sunglasses on for this just shortly if I put any more layers on, and you can see the difference, between the ones that cope well with it, with the exception of the Souffle, that's still wet, but there's a huge difference. So let's try with the Posca pen and the Sharpie marker now and just see what happens here. The Posca has taken much better on this black paper than it did on the tan paper. I'll show you a wee comparison just once we finish doing this bit. Both sets of paper, I would just like to point out, it's high quality paper. This is not cheap paper. It is artist quality paper. It's not just something, you know, I've picked up in a pound shop or whatever. And onto the Sharpie marker. See, that looks really white. It looks really white, and then it's just all going to disappear again. We shall see. Yeah, so just to compare side by side, this is the Posca paint pen on the toned paper, and this is it on the black paper. So it seems to me that although it seems whiter on here, it actually stands out better on the black paper. So again, it's one of those things, you might use it on an odd occasion if you're wanting to do something like that. And just bring this back in as well. The Sharpie marker has done what we thought it would do, and it's just soaked straight into the paper. Right, the third and final test that I have already done was I have filled in a sheet of paper with coloured pencil. Now I've put down 3 layers of a dark coloured pencil and I have used a colourless blender over the top of it to burnish it and blend it all smooth, and then I have gone and used these pens over the top. Now I deliberately did this 2 days ago and it was to allow the gel pen time to settle to see how it was going to react sitting on top of the pencil. And here are the results. So on the left hand column, that was a Prismacolor purple pencil, and in this right hand column this was done with a Polychromos, and it was just to let you see the difference, because I know a lot of you out there are colourists and you use your white gel pens for embellishments, highlights, etc. So I wanted you to see how they behave on top of some coloured pencil. Now you can pause the video and study this in a bit more depth if that's what you want to do, but I'm just going to run through them very quickly in the order that they are here to let you know how I found them and how I got on with them. The Uni Bowl Broad, basically I had the same situation as I've just had with that other paper. It was very scratchy and I had real difficulty, and you can see there where I've written the word broad, I had real problems getting it to flow properly on top of the pencil, and the same in the scrub test, it just didn't do well at all. So I hate to say it, and I know it is, you know, people's favourites and they are like a go-to pen. I really don't like this as a white gel pen for myself. It's almost bottom of the list, but not quite. I will rank them at the end of this video by my preference, just for your pleasure. Moving on to the medium Uni-Ball, it fared slightly better. It was a lot easier and it flowed a lot better, but you can see there that it is quite difficult to see, and the coloured pencil is actually starting to come up through the gel itself. So I think over time eventually this would fade to like a light purple colour, and I have seen that happen in colouring books. It seems to be worse, and there's a handy hint for you if you are a colourist. If you use a blender pencil and burnish the page before you use gel pen, less of the pigment will soak through because it's got that clear coating of a colourless blender on top of it. So there's a handy hint for you. On the Polychromos, it seemed to come out a lot better on the Polychromos than it did in the Prismacolor, that particular pen. The Jelly Rolls performed spectacularly well, as expected. The colour, when filling in, seemed to be a lot brighter in the Polychromos than it did on the Prismacolor. I don't know how many layers that you could put down. Again, it'll depend on the paper and how much abuse you've given it with your pencils before you get to the gel pen stage. So both of the Jelly Rolls performed well on that, and I was quite pleased with them, and I'd be happy to use them in my colouring. Going on to the Souffle, the nice thing about the Souffle is, again, with it just being a slightly different beast, the edges of what it is you're doing are much softer and much more rounded. So if you were going for a shape where you wanted that sort of soft edge and you weren't wanting harsh lines, the Souffle would be the way forward. And that has come up beautifully as well in terms of that embossed feeling as well. It feels really nice to run your finger over. So yeah, I would recommend the Jelly Roll Souffle. It has its place, but I would say its overall performance is quite limited in terms of what it can do for you. The Pentel Hybrid, the colour's starting to seep through on this, on the Polychromos. So much as I like that pen, I'm probably not going to use it much because the colour's starting to soak through the pen already. And exactly the same things happened with the Prismacolor as well, so it is not specific. I did pick these pencils for a reason, because the Prismacolors are wax based and the Polychromos are oil based. So it was just to give you a comparison, and I did use appropriate colourless blenders for each as well. Onto the Milky Pop. It's fared quite well. I was quite surprised at this. It doesn't seem to, pardon the pun, it doesn't seem to pop off the page as much, but it's held its colour against the dark purple background, and it's performed reasonably well on top of the paper, and I had no issues when I was actually using the pen on top of the pencil. So I was pleasantly surprised with that. So again, that might be one that I would favour more for my colouring, although it is not as stark and bright as your Uni-Balls or your Jelly Rolls. On to the Posca, and it just looks so washed out, so washed out, and yeah, I really wasn't a fan of this at all. It feels nice and smooth going down on top of the pencil, and some of the gel pens didn't feel like that. So in terms of that, it's nice to use, but the outcome of it I wasn't particularly impressed with, and I would be loath to use it on darker colours like this purple especially. And onto the Sharpie Oil Marker. The results speak for itself. I thought with having that layer of wax or oil in between the paper and the marker that it might fare slightly better, and it has done nothing. Now there is a water-based one of these available, and you can't get them in the UK, and I couldn't get one over from the US in time to do this video, but I have a feeling that it will perform more like the Posca Pen. That would be my assumption. If anybody owns the water-based Sharpie, leave me a comment and, you know, down in the box below. Let me know what you think of it, if you use it, if you've tried it. That would be really interesting to find out. So unfortunately with time constraints, I just couldn't get one here quick enough. So in terms of our overall performance, I'm just going to give you a quick look at all of these again. So there is the coloured pencil. There is the performance on black paper, and last but not least, the performance on the tanned paper. Now for me, there's the thing that I've learned from doing this, and I don't use white pen an awful lot, which is, you know, that's the ironic thing about this entire video. I've ended up with millions of them without even trying. The thing about this though is that I've learned is that each of these pens have their own merits and their own downfalls, and I could find a use for several of them, but for different things depending on what I was doing. So, trying to take everything into consideration, I'm going to rank them from worst to best. And this is purely in my opinion, and I'm going to give you reasons why. At the bottom of the list, I don't think I need to say much about that, is the Sharpie oil-based marker. It's not really meant for using on paper, let's be realistic, but I was kind of hoping for a slightly better result than I did, so that is going in the sin bin. Next up from the bottom is the Posca Pen, and I know these are quite popular with some people, some colourists. The reason that it's so far down the list is the only time I would really use this is when I'm doing a colouring page and it just wasn't up to scratch. When I can get a much better result with a gel pen, I wouldn't bother using this. It may be better used on other paper or, you know, other materials, but not for me, just not for me at all. Now, this is where I started to struggle with deciding which ones I like best, but unfortunately it's the Uni Bowl Signal Broad. It's just too scratchy. The reason that this is so far down my list is probably due to the fact that it is a roller ball, and I did say right at the start that I don't get on well with roller balls. It's very inconsistent. When it's working, it works really, really well, but it's just too moody for my liking. It's very temperamental, so that is why it is ranking so far down the list. Next after that is the medium size Signal, the 0.7. It's much more pleasant to use. I didn't get the same scratchiness using like that, and I seem to get on better with it in general. So if I had to choose between the two Uni-Ball pens, I would take the original size one instead of the broad one every day of the week, because the ink flow is much more generous as well, so you get less skipping and less of that horrible scratchy texture when the pen's actually going onto the paper. The next after that, I would say these are equal, the Pentel Milky Pop and the Jelly Roll Souffle. That's not the Souffle, that's not this one, the Souffle. I've placed these together in this ranking because they are so different from the rest of the gel pens, because they do have that much more transparent look about them, and they performed very similarly. And I would probably say that I like the Milky Pop slightly better, and it's just because you can see what you're doing when you're actually putting it down, whereas the Souffle is very, very pale and it's difficult, and it's really easy for you to smudge your hand over it. So I would probably say I like the Milky Pop slightly better. However, with the Souffle, you do get that lovely embossed sort of raised bumpy feeling in whatever it is you've done, which would be nice to add a bit of texture and dimension to your picture. So again, it does have its place. Next is the Jelly Roll number 8, and I know you can't see the lettering on that, but that is the number 8 I've got in my hand. It's a really good all-rounder, and I would say that is it's a good jack of all trades, master of none. I liked how it laid down on the paper and that you could layer it up, and it gave quite a sharp, vibrant white. They're relatively inexpensive, so I would say that that's an everyday white gel pen. You know, yeah, I'm happy to use that. only surpassed by the Jelly Roll 10 because it has got a slightly thicker nib and it gives a much more sort of vivid white. The way that these pens actually operate in terms of using them are exactly the same. You know, it's the same case and it's the same nibs and everything. So in terms of workmanship, the reliability of them is much better as well in terms of skipping and that kind of thing. So I'm definitely going to be using these more often moving forward. And finally, at the top of my list is the Pentel Hybrid Gel. This is fabulous. For someone that doesn't like rollerball pens and doesn't get on well with them, I got on spectacularly well with this one. It's got a nice grip as well. It just feels a bit more substantial and it's very, very reliable in terms of laydown and also the vibrancy of repeated filling in. And I'm just going to bring these back just to show you again. It's so smooth. It really, really is. It's so smooth and is an absolute joy to write with as well. So there you have it. That is a look at all of the white pens that I have accrued, even though I don't use them very often. So I hope that's been a bit helpful to you if you are in the market for a white pen. And even if you don't agree with my opinions, I'm hoping that's given you enough information for you to decide on what would suit you best. And maybe you can give some of these a go. If you found this video useful, please feel free to give me a thumbs up. That would be really nice. And if you haven't subscribed already and you do like this kind of thing, feel free to hit that button. I do boot out 2 videos a week, once on a Monday and once on a Friday. So that gives you something to look forward to for the weekend and something to cheer up the beginning of your working week. Isn't that a great idea? Alright guys, that's everything for today. So thank you again so much for joining me and we'll see you soon back in the colour cave.